going to be taking a trip down memory lane to remember my life here in Hopkinton and how it came to be. And my first recollection would be the remembrance of my grandparents, Patrick Beattie and his wife Mary Ann Kelly. Patrick Beattie was born in 1857 off of Fruit Street near where the Goldman residence is, and in my youth it was known as Smyberho and is now part of the land that the town bought when they acquired the property on Fruit Street. Patrick and Mary Ann Kelly, who was born in Ireland, had 3 children, Catherine, Joseph, and John. They bought the home on Wood Street that I grew up in 1873 to raise their family and to later turn that land over to their heirs on land where I now live. Patrick worked during the summer months as a farmer, raising crops to feed his family. And in the winter months, he would go to Central Falls, Rhode Island, where there was a large brewery that the many men from Hopkinton went and worked in the brewery during the winter months when they were unable to farm. Their youngest child, John Francis Beattie, who was my father, was born on January 11th, 1901. He was born in the homestead on Wood Street, and he found out at a later date in his life, when necessity made him travel to Canada, that there was never a birth certificate filed by the doctor who delivered him. And in subsequent looking around, he found that there were 5 people that were born around the same time that had no birth certificates. And the story goes that the doctor was on a drunk and he forgot to record the births. My father went to school at what is now 1 Ash Street, which was a 2-room schoolhouse heated by coal stoves, and the water was brought in from the local well. And that was before the Center School was built, which was built in 1927. My father left Hopkinton as a young man and went to Boston and got a chauffeur's license. He proceeded on to New York and then to Miami, where he chauffeured for several distinguished families. As his parents aged, he returned back to Hopkinton and chauffeured for a family that was located in Framingham and Newton, and did that from 1927 to 1934. In 1934, 1 month after Prohibition had been repealed, he set up shop in what we now know as the Star Package Store on Main Street, right next to the police station. He only went to the 8th grade, but he was quite an entrepreneur well before that was in vogue. He ran the package store until 1940, when he sold it to the late Mr. Flumer, who ran it for many, many years until he passed away. In 1940, he opened up a restaurant bar in the homestead on Wood Street, which served food and had a full-time chef as well as a full-time bar. The house was very appropriate for this activity, as it was a large colonial home built in 1760 with 6 fireplaces, including a large fireplace had the cooking iron. During World War II, while he was running the bar, he also went to work for Lombard Governor, which was an operation in Ashland that had defense projects. And he worked as a guard there nights from 11 to 7. During the day, my mother would run the bar, and They ran that bar until 1944, when during World War II there was a shortage on gasoline, there was a shortage on cigarettes and on liquor, and the business was really being threatened by all these shortages. So my father closed the bar up and sought to do some different things. He was a salesman. He sold fuller brush. And in the summer of 1946-47, when things were really slow after the war, he came up with this idea that he and myself and my brother would go from one house to another house to buy bottles, beer bottles, soda bottles, etc. He would pay half the price that the person would get in return, and from that money, we lived the entire summer. My father was a great storyteller. He had tremendous memories of this town that he grew up in. He worked as a grocery boy for the Hopkinton Supply, and on Saturdays would travel to all parts of Hopkinton delivering supplies to the various customers. Thus, he became familiar with all the different parts of the town, where oftentimes, if you lived on Hayden Row, you only knew about Hayden Row. He would tell about his sledding when he was a young boy, starting excuse me, up where the middle school is located and going all the way down almost to the state park facility. Of course, there was no traffic, and I guess the streets were not terribly plowed down to the macadam so that they were able to slide. After the war was over, he went to work for the people that owned the Central House, which was the large building up next to the drugstore, which sadly was demolished a few years ago. He and my mother ran the bar and the package store from 1947 until 1951. And while he was there, he had an interesting situation develop. The man that ran the package store during the evening hours would go home for supper, and they would lock the door, and there was a bell, and that bell would ring in on the bar side. So the bell rang, and my father went around to let someone in, and when he got there was nobody there. And he thought maybe it was kids, you know, playing around. And so he waited in the hallway, and the bell rang again. And he opened the door, and it was a local person well known to my father. And my father was very agitated to think that he would do this. And the gentleman, being of slight stature, my father grabbed him by the nape of the neck and the back of his belt, and he hung him on the climbing peg of the telephone pole right outside of what was then Colella's Market. The next thing my dad knew was that the police arrived and wanted to know if he had done it and why he had done it, and they lowered the gentleman back onto the sidewalk. In 1930, my father had occasion to visit a local attorney in Framingham to settle some affairs. And at that time, he was still doing chauffeur work, and he walked into the office with his chauffeur's uniform on and met the then secretary, Catherine McGurn, who was born and brought up in Milford. Story tells that my mother was terribly impressed with his impeccable attire, but on the different occasions that he came into the office, she couldn't understand why he didn't take his hat off. Well, as she and he began dating, and she became to know him better, she realized the reason he didn't take his hat off was that he was bald. And he turned about 30, and he was just about totally bald. However, they continued to meet and to date, and they were married in 1935. And during that time, they bought a piece of property down on C Street from the bank, because this was right at the close of the Depression, and they bought a Cape house for $350. And they totally gutted the house, and that was where they brought me home when I was born in 1936. My mother was a remarkable woman. She worked for this attorney, and he was also an associate justice at the Framingham Court for 15 years, and she was a very bright, smart woman, both intellectually and able to be a tremendous homemaker. She sewed, she braided rugs, she made all of our clothes, etc. She was also a big asset to my father as he pursued his various business ventures. She also became very involved in the community. She was the president of the Historical Society when it first started, the Hopkinton Women's Club, the Hopkinton Garden Club, and she and another woman were the first two women to serve on the Democratic Town Committee. During the time that we lived on C Street, when I was 3 years old, we welcomed my brother, David Beattie, to the family. And during the time that we lived there, we through stories, experienced the 1938 hurricane. And my dad used to tell, he had a brand new car, and he parked it in front of the Star Package store during the hurricane, and put the emergency brake on, but watched the wind blow the car up to the intersection of Grove and Main Street, and then blow it back again. We were very fortunate because, as many of you may know, the town was without power for a considerable length of time. But fortunately, we had a gas refrigerator, and we were able to keep milk for babies, for different friends and neighbors and relatives during that hard period of time. In 1942, due to my father's health, we moved to Wood Street and lived up over what was the Whitehall Country Club. And it was from that location that I went to the first grade at Center School. Center School did not have a cafeteria. If you were a bus pupil, you must bring your lunch. If you lived close enough to walk, you walked home for lunch. And ironically, one of my classmates, who often feeling sorry that I had to eat my lunch every day at school, brought me home for lunch. In years to come, she would become my sister-in-law. From the Center School, from the 6th grade, the normal path was to go to what we know as the old high school on Main Street, which was for students 7th grade to 12th grade. However, there was an overcrowding problem at that time. So several 7th graders, including myself, were picked to go to school in the town hall. We sat at long tables. We took our books home with us when we went home, and we brought them back in the morning. While we were there, we also would go to Hughes's, which was located next to the town hall, and it was a variety store. It had a soda fountain. It sold groceries, and it also sold newspapers and tobacco products. We also would go to Murphy's drugstore, which was located where the photographic images studio is now. And that was a regular drugstore with all the medicinal aspects of it, but it also had a soda fountain, and that's where we would spend our recess. When we first moved to Wood Street during the war, we had to get a new phone number. We also were surprised to hear that we also had to get what they called a party line. In those days, there could be 2 people on the party line, or there could be as many as 4 people on the party line. And one of the people on the line with us was a man by the name of Herman Latta, who ran a business and a plowing company in Woodville. We always knew when it was snowing out, because when the phone rang at 2 o'clock in the morning on Herman's ring, it was the highway department telling him it was time to get the plows out. From town hall, 7th grade, we moved to the 8th grade at the high school, and were there until we graduated in 1954. During that time, I was involved with 4-H and very active in Girl Scouts. The town, being as small as it was, with a population of around 3,200 people, it's like that show that says that everybody knows your name. The town was like a big family and would look after you if you were good and also if you were bad. And it was nothing for a friend to call my parents to let them know if I had done something wrong. The interesting thing was that while we were at the town hall, the man that was the janitor there at the town hall also was the police chief. So he certainly knew all of us 7th graders as we became 10th graders, 11th graders, and 12th graders. High school in those days was really fun. We went to school from 8 to 1. We had a 15-minute recess, of which we brought our lunch. There were less than 100 kids in the entire school, and because of that, we were able to do things that are not allowable now. Every spring, just before school got out, the whole school would take a trip to Provincetown that was paid for by the student council. The seniors would work for 4 years with cake sales, dances, etc. And during April vacation, we would leave on marathon morning and go to Philadelphia, to Washington, D.C., and to New York City. It was a fun time to live in this town, and I meant to mention that it was rather unique and would probably not be allowed nowadays, but when I went to school, the buses only ran the main roads, and it was a coach bus that ultimately went to Worcester, went to Framingham, went to Milford. If you lived off of Wood Street, you had to walk down to Wood Street to get the bus. And one of my classmates lived on Lumber Street, and she had to walk from Lumber Street to Granite Street and then down over where the railroad tracks were and out to Hayden Row Street to get the bus. In 1954, and in years around that same period of time, we experienced some very severe hurricanes. And at that time, my dad was running his business in a modified 2-car garage. He only sold bottled beer, which he cooled in large coolers, which we would haul ice from either Hopedale or Northborough on a regular basis to chill the beer. The power then, again this time, was out for a considerable length of time, but he was in business. He put candles in the empty beer bottles and served his customers as he did when the electricity was running. When I was a senior in high school, I got a job working in Framingham, in downtown Framingham. The bus would wait for us in front of Colella's as we ran down the hill from school, and we would be able to punch the time clock at the various stores at 1:30. And then the bus at 5:30 would wait for us to get to the depot and bring us home. The buses in those days were very accommodating. As the bus pulled into Ashland by the depot, it would wait for the train, for the several gentlemen who worked in Boston who would take the train out to Ashland. And also when I worked in Framingham, on Friday nights the stores would be open till 9 o'clock. So after we closed up, we would walk over to the train depot and we would wait for the bus, which left at 9:30, and I would get off where the drugstore is now and walk home to Wood Street. It was perfectly safe for me as a teenager to walk from Main Street in Hopkinton to Wood Street, which was a distance of about a mile. We had many activities many were self-made. We utilized the building at 1 Ash Street, which was then turned into a gymnasium after it had been a school, and we have all the basketball games would be played there, girls and boys. We would have dances there, we would have donkey basketball there, and it was a wonderful time to live in Hopkinton. At my home, we would have sledding parties, as we had a large hill, and after the sledding parties were finished, my mother would make a hot punch and we would all sit by the fireplace and have punch and cookies. One time, I think it was prior to a football game, the notorious football game on Thanksgiving Day with Ashland, we had a party at the house, and we had about between 75 and 100 people there. And they got in line and they were doing the bunny hop right through the 3 rooms of the downstairs. I all of a sudden caught my mother standing at the kitchen door with a rather frantic look on her face. And she said, "Please tell them to stop. I'm afraid that the floors are going to give in." And needless to say, they did stop. One of the assets of going to the high school was the teacher who taught the history classes. Her name was Ellen Duffy. She was here prior to 1920, and she retired in 1954 with our graduating class. She taught civics, as well as world history, and problems of democracy was the senior course. She was a large advocate of citizen participation in government, and she encouraged all of her students to take a role in their community and to be part of it. And I think that I must have heard that at an early age, as in years to come I became involved in my community. My father, working at the Central House during the late 40s and the early 50s, left us on Wood Street with no transportation, as my mother didn't drive. So on most Friday nights we would get a ride up to what is now the drugstore area, where every Friday night they held an auction. And my mother loved antiques. She loved being able to retrieve items that would enhance our 1760 home. And right now in my kitchen, I have a round oak table that my mother bought at one of these auctions for 50 cents. I guess now they sell for $700 or $800. My father was a very well-known man in the community, having been a businessman for a long time, but he also was a very proud Hopkintonian. And in later years, he would tell people, if you don't live in Hopkinton, you're only camping out. My mother, during the period of the Second World War and thereafter, took up writing poetry. And I think maybe it was a way for her to express herself. And I'd like to share with you a poem that she wrote in 1944, and it was published in the Boston Post on October 21st of that month. And the title of it is My Spare Time. I wash and sew and cook for four, can all those apples or scrub the floor, put all the summer clothes away, take out the woolens bright and gay, iron the curtains with ruffles wide, mending fine the holes to hide, kissing well a small scratched knee, can any son be sweet as he? And then with supper dishes o'er, my two small fry upon the floor, before the fireplace warm and bright, the wood I fed, it wasn't light. We have a story short and sweet. They get so sleepy near the heat, and then to bed with laugh and shout. By this time I'm about worn out. When all is quiet and serene, I settle down to sew a seam on sister's new red pinafore, or buttons, buttons by the score. But really though, I won't complain, for sunshine always follows rain. But this I know, and know it's true, there's always one more thing to do. From early morn till setting sun, this woman's work is never done. Our daddy's good and sweet and kind, and I know that way back in his mind, there keeps repeating this loud chime, what does she do with her spare time? This is so appropriate even today. After graduating from high school, I went on to Chandler School for Women in Boston, where I took an executive secretarial course and proceeded to for my career as being an executive secretary at various places, Natick Labs, the Fenwal Corporation, just to name a few. During the course of my high school years, it was a place where people went and met friends. We went to Sandy Island, and there was a place there called Mac's Cabin, where they served soft drinks and hamburgers and hot dogs. They had jukeboxes that you could dance to, and it kind of became a place where the youth of Hopkinton went. We also went to the former Congregational Church, Eldridge Hall, where they held dances and teen canteen. So those were the places that we frequented as young people. During this time, I met the man who would become my husband, William Harrington, and he grew up on Ash Street, and being just a little older than he and I, to this day, often share memories about him growing up on one side of town and me growing up on the other, and remembering the different things and people that are long past gone. We were married, and we had our wedding reception at our home, my parents' home, and there were about 100 people there, and it was a wonderful, bright and sunny day, and it was a nice way to start off a marriage which this year will culminate in 55 years. We were blessed to have 4 children: Cynthia, who is a registered nurse; Mary Lou, who's a dental assistant; Kathleen, who works for NSTAR; and our son David, who works for Schofield Brothers Engineering. The children, we have a total of 7 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild, and our own children, our grandchildren, and our little granddaughter bring us great joy and happiness. And life has been wonderful for us. We've had a lot of heartaches, but we've managed to get through it. And as they say in the wedding vows, we hope that you live to see your children's children, and we are so blessed that we have been able to do that. The children were not very old. In fact, one of them was about 5 weeks old when my mother had a very serious heart attack. She battled that disease for 4.5 years. My dad was a diabetic. He, had to watch not only what he ate, but that he ate on a regular basis, which put a real stress on myself and my husband and our families in catering to their needs while living in Milford and back and forth. During this period of time, we dealt with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and different players from different agencies coming to visit to talk about the impending construction of Route 495 and how that would impact us. It was a long time. I believe it was about 7 years that we waited, and every time someone came, there was a different plan. I remember specifically a man by the name of Mr. Waterman coming to the house, and as he left, his words of comfort and encouragement were, "Remember, it's better to go than to be left on the side of the road." On September 11th, 1965, two gentlemen arrived from the state with a document telling us that as of September 1st of that year, 11 days prior, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had taken possession of our home, my dad's business, and roughly 15 acres of land. They had been warned and prepared by the people that were located in Hopkinton at the state park on a regular basis from the planning department that my mother was very ill, and so when they came, they handled the situation very gently, and they told us that we would need to go to the Framingham court on November 1st to pick up the check. My mother had said for many months, "I wish they'd hurry up and come and tell us what they're going to do, because I just want to live long enough to get my name on that check." My dad and I and a couple of the children went and picked up the check on November 1st. It was endorsed, and I deposited it in the bank. And on December 4th of that year, just a little over a month, my mother passed away. My father at that time was considering making a bid on a piece of property that was located west of where we were, that was in between the north and southbound lanes of the highway. And it was a house that had been built on land that we had sold to the gentleman. The house is a ranch, and at its widest point, it's 60 feet wide. So it was unable to travel down the road, so it was only of value to someone that had abutting land. My father submitted a sealed bid for a 7-room house with a detached garage, the bid being $105. He was the only bidder. And in February of 1966, we moved the house. We, the Woonsocket Coal and Ice Company, moved the house through the woods, and it's the house where my father and my brother lived after our big home was demolished in July of 1966. They moved the house through the woods, and we placed a glass of water on the fireplace mantle. And after the house was in position, we checked, and there wasn't a drop of water that had been spilt. My husband and I, after my mother passed away, we were the recipients of a lot of land from my dad, and we built a home in 1966, 67, and we continue to live there now. My father was very family-oriented, and he was so delighted to have us back living on the land that he had inherited from his parents. He also talked about how important family was, and it was his desire that his children and grandchildren live on the land as well. As of this date, my husband and I, our 4 children, our 7 grandchildren live on the property that was acquired by my grandfather in 1873. On the hill above us lives my brother in the house that was moved, and his son lives behind him. So all of my father's children and grandchildren live on the land that was so near and dear to him. The big house that I have referred to was built in 1760. It was a center chimney colonial with a very curvy stairway, and it had 6 fireplaces. In those days, history tells us that the first thing they built was the fireplace, the chimney. And in our house, the chimney base in the cellar was 8 by 8. My father was born in that house, and he lived to see the house demolished, which was a very sad day for all of us. When he bid on the house and we were in the process of moving the new house, we also had the task of emptying the big house in which 5 generations had lived. It had 2 attics and 2 cellars, and it was not an easy task. And as we emptied each room, we closed the door, not only to know that everything was out of it, but to close the door on memories. The worst part of the whole 495 experience was dealing with the state and the things that they did and did not do. At that time, the town dump was located adjacent to where McIntyre Loom Company is now. The state took the property by eminent domain and did not exterminate it adequately. If you have any knowledge of rats, when their source of food is gone, they cross the road. Well, they certainly did, and they were underneath the new foundation of the garage that we had just moved in, and in various other places, to the point that we had to tie the dog up, and we also had to keep the children inside because we had decon spread all over the place. At one point, I was so angry that nobody seemed to want to deal with this that we went to the facility trailer that the state was using, and after inquiring about who I needed to talk to, I contacted a representative of the State Department of Public Works to explain the situation. The gentleman apparently didn't understand totally what I was telling him. And his comment to me was, "You country people make me sick. You all use your backlands as dumps. And then when the state comes along, it becomes our problem. We never used our backland as a dump. This was the town dump we were talking about." So I explained to the gentleman that this was a serious public health issue, and 24 hours from now, if there was no action, I was going to contact the State Department of Public Health. Lo and behold, the next morning at 10 o'clock, in drove a big black state car with 4 gentlemen in it, and they took care of the problem immediately. While they were building 495, they would have a trench across the driveway going to this home. I wouldn't be able to get my father out for doctor's appointments or things that he needed to tend to. And it seemed at that time that we were fighting this battle alone. No one from the town acted as interference for the dilemma that we found ourselves in. I became involved in community service when my daughters were Girl Scouts. Having been a Girl Scout myself, I knew how important the Girl Scout program was to young girls. So I started out being the calendar mother, and then I was the cookie mother, and then I was the neighborhood chairman of the Hopkinton Girl Scouts. We took the girls on various and wonderful trips. We took 200 and some odd Scouts into the Boston Ice Capades one time, and we never lost a child. We took a group of Girl Scouts into the State House, and one of the highlights of my tenure was that we and the leader, Sam Kelly, took the older Scouts to Washington, D.C. for a week, where we stayed at an international Girl Scout house, which is located in Virginia. I also was a CCD teacher as my children were going through CCD and getting ready for First Communion, etc. When the establishment across from my dad's house became a nightclub with a flashy neon sign, I took exception to their operation and became involved in an aspect of town government. That was property was known as the Joker's Four, and my dad and I attended every selectmen's meeting to let the selectmen know that things that were going on there were not appropriate, including noise and cars parked all over the street. I went from there to have an interest in town government and served for many years on the zoning board, the planning board, the youth commission, and as a town selectman. My interest in Hopkinton has always been to make it a better place for my children and my grandchildren, and I felt that I couldn't rely on someone else to step forward to save my neighborhood if I wasn't willing to do it myself. So I have immensely enjoyed my time in town government, and I encourage other people, especially young people, to become involved in their community. Several years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, my daughter, Kathy, was contacted by a friend regarding a young girl in Mexico who had an incurable cancer of the eye disease, which was quite common in Mexican women. And Kathy brought the family here, the mother, the father, the little girl, and her little brother. And we were able to provide them with housing through the generosity of a member of this community. And in total, we raised $56,000 for her care, the care of the family, and her treatment at Tufts New England Medical Center. It was an awe-inspiring endeavor, something that we will always remember. Yasmin was a little girl. She went to the Elmwood School while they were here. She had surgery done at Tufts. She had to have radiation done every day, and we were fortunate to have people volunteer to be in a carpool to take her back and forth for the radiation. She was also selected for My One Wish, and they sent the family to Walt Disney World down in Florida. They live in the mountainous part of Mexico, and the life experience that they had for the 3 or 4 years that they were here is something that they'll never forget. One of the favorite stories I like to tell, and it's so important for generations to share these stories. When my father was a boy, the trolley line went right by his house going into Woodville. And that was around the time when the Hopkinton Springs were such a big item, and they had the hotel and everything there in Hopkinton. So He used to tell, especially my son, about the stories about the trolley and how he used to go out and put stones on the tracks. And when the trolley came along, the conductor would have to get off and stop the trolley and get off and take the stones off. Well, one day my father decided that he'd be very brave, and he put a very large boulder on the tracks. So the conductor came along, stopped the car, got off, and in removing the large boulder, he saw my father hiding in the woods. And he got a certain amount of punishment, and the conductor was not happy at all. So he used to tell that story to my son David. And in a few years after that, we had occasion for my father to be invited to go to the library to help identify some photographs that they had that had been made into slides. So I said to my son David, you go with him and help him navigate, and I'll pick you up. So when I went to get them, here were about 20 women sitting in the back room of the library, and my father and David, and they were putting slides up on the screen. And in the course of the little get-together, they put up a slide that showed a trolley at the corner of Wood and Elm Street making its way up the Wood Street hill. And in the middle of them showing this, my son David hollered out, "Papa, there really was a trolley." And unbeknownst to us, I guess all those years that he heard the trolley story, he thought that my father was just telling a story, that it wasn't true. And the women in the library that day got the biggest kick out of the fact that David saw the real picture, and now he knew there was a trolley. Another experience that I had when my dad was running the bar in the garage, and as I said before, my mother didn't drive a car. So after I got my license, my father would depend on me to help him navigate customers who either didn't have a ride, didn't drive a car, or just needed a ride home. And there was a man that lived in Woodville that I took home on a regular basis. And when I would get up Wood Street a little ways before I got into the village, he would say to me, "What do you say? You want to take me to Westboro?" And I'd say, "Oh no, I can't, because if I'm not right back, my father will be worried." So that was one occasion. When I first started dating my husband, we had a date for a particular Saturday night, and he arrived at the door, and my father had said to me before that, "Are you going Framingham way?" And I said, "I really don't know." So I asked my soon-to-be husband if we were going Framingham way, and he said yes, that we were going to the movies. And so I said, "Well, my father wants me to drive this gentleman home." That was fine, but it was all new to my husband. So I got in the gentleman's car with him in the front seat, and my husband followed, and we went down into Framingham, and I knew where the gentleman lived, and I pulled up in front of his house and left the keys over the visor, and I got out and got in with my soon-to-be husband, and we went to the movies. And my husband said to me, "Who was that guy?" I said, "He's the chief of police," because he was an old friend of my dad's, and they used to drive taxi together way back in the 20s. And of course, if he wanted a drink, he couldn't drink in Framingham, so he would come to my father's bar knowing that we would get him home safe and sound. When we lived on C Street in the summer of 1942, in the area where Walcott Valley townhouses are now located, was a big field called Vellucci's Field, and trucks of servicemen en route to Camp Devens did bivouac that one night in that field. And as the pictures show, they lined up on C Street to go out onto Route 85 on their way to Fort Devens. And there's pictures there of my brother and I up on the side of the slat-bodied truck. And while they were waiting, our milkman arrived with ever so many bottles of milk, and they were just aghast, and my mother gave all the milk to the soldiers that were on their way to Fort Devens. When I was elected to the Board of Selectmen in 1995, we were the only Board of Selectmen out of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts that was all female. And the media made a big issue about the fact that we were all female. And we had a Worcester television station there one night, and the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald, as well as the local papers. And one reporter said to me, "You must be a women's libber." And I looked at her and said, "Oh no, but I've always been a liberated woman." When we were growing up, there were two buildings in this town where public events happened. One was the town hall, where all the high school proms, the high school operettas, plays, the town meeting, the town voting, all of that took place in the town hall. The town hall, the second floor of the town hall was like most old town halls of that era. It had a large floor area, it had a stage, and it had a balcony. And some pictures that I was able to come by show my class junior prom in the town hall winding the maypole. And also, that's where we had our graduation. There were also private organizations that rented the town hall and held square dances. And at 1 Ash Street at the gym, there were, as I mentioned, the basketball games. And another place that had a lot of activity was the Grange Hall down on Hayden Row, which is now the historical building. They held whist parties and their Grange meetings and any 4-H activities are like that. So those were the areas of congregating. The other place was the Eldridge Hall, which was located in the basement level of the former Congregational Church. And that was named for a man by the name of Fred Eldridge, who was a great benefactor to the church. And they opened their doors to scout meetings, to 4-H meetings, to dances, to tin can dances and the such, and also to the Women's Club and Garden Club, that people needed a place to hold a meeting. I think that's the story of my life as I lived through Hopkinton. I also wanted to share with you that my grandchildren are 7th generation Beatties to live in this town. They are also 12th generation Carters, which was my mother's family name. And her first ancestor arrived in Boston in 1635. They're 8th generation Harringtons on my husband's side. The Harringtons still live on Ash Street in Hopkinton. And they're the 5th generation to live on the land that was purchased by my grandfather, Patrick Beattie, in 1873. Thank you for listening.